111. The absence of data about the size of Africa's population in the 15th century makes it impossible to carry out any scientific assessment of the results of the population outflow, but nothing suggests that there was any increase in the continent's population over the centuries of slaving, although that was the trend in other parts of the world. Lack of increase or even slight increases would have represented a deficit in terms of in terms of population projection, since fewer babies were born. That would otherwise have been the case if millions of childbearing age had not been eliminated. Finally, on this particular topic, it is essential to recognize that the Atlantic slave trade on the Indian Ocean has been called, quote, the East African slave trade, end quote, and, quote, the Arab slave trade, end quote, for so long that it obscures the extent of which it was the European slave trade. When the slave trade from East Africa was at its height in the late 18th century and in the early 19th century, the destination of captives was a plantation societies of Mauritania's Reunion and Seychelles, as well as the New World via the Cape of Good Hope. Because Africans laboring as slaves from Zanzibar to Persia in the 16th and 19th century were all ultimately serving the European capitalist system, which had become all-pervasive. The Sultan of Zanzibar did not eat from cloves himself. An emphasis of population loss has such a highly relevant to the question of socio-economic development. In recent times, since imperial agencies have decided on the Malthusian line of the developing world, it is being forgotten that population growth played a major role in European development in providing labor markets and the pressures which led to further advance. The Japanese population growth had similar positive effects, while in other parts of Asia, which remained pre-capitalist, the size of the population led to a much more intensive exploration of the land that has never been exploration of the land than has ever been the case in what is still a sparsely peopled African continent. Even in the absence of statistics, it seems that West Africa was always a more densely populated section of the continent than either Central or East Africa. It was there that the brunt of the slaving fell, warping the development of some of the most advanced areas in all of Africa, such as Yorubaland, Igboland, and Akan country. African economic activities were affected both directly by population loss and indirectly by other features of slave trading, notably the violence of insecurity that engendered. Before the 18th century, the Portuguese and Dutch actually discouraged slaving on the Gold Coast, for they recognized that it would be incompatible with the gold trade. However, by the end of the 17th century, gold had been discovered in Brazil, and the importance of gold supply from Africa was lessened. Within the total Atlantic pattern, African slaves became more important than gold, and Brazilian gold was offered for African captives at Wanda and Accra. At that point, slaving began undermining the, quote, Gold Coast economy and made large inroads into the gold trade. Slave raiding and kidnapping made it unsafe to mine and to travel, and in any event, the resort to warfare or for captives proved more profitable than gold mining. On the contemporary European Observer noted that, quote, as one fortunate marauding makes a native rich in a day they therefore exert themselves rather in war, robbery, and plunder than in their old business of digging and collecting gold. End quote. What was so clearly evidenced is the above example must have been true for all other branches of economic activity, and especially for agriculture. Occasionally, in certain localities, food production was stimulated to provide supplies for slave ships, but the overall consequence of slaving on agricultural activities in Western and Central Africa were negative. Europeans on the scene did not commit to that effort, and were such commitments are not available, and inference is nonetheless inescapable. Labor was drawn off from agriculture, and for those remaining, conditions were unsettled. Dahomey, which in the 16th century was renowned for exporting food to parts of what is now Togo, was suffering through famines in the 19th century. In the enlightening parallel is the way migrant labor and cash crops affected food economy of colonial Africa and made famine endemic in some districts. Just as the slave trade and overseas trade in general had multiplier effects on European development, so it had multiplier effects on African underdevelopment. Where there was integration across national boundaries in Europe, there was disintegration in Africa. The creation of growing points in the European economy and the establishment of backward and forward linkages were all out of the question in Africa, because foreign trade was not a logical extension in internal production and exchange. So they wouldn't let them trade inside Africa. On the contrary, a great deal of time and energy went into activities like slaving and elephant hunting, which were not designed to permit an expansion of Africans' ability to produce foodstuffs and other essentials of human consumption. Hey, Vaughn. Good to see you. Special attention needs to be paid to ivory exports because they are more important than the sport of captives as far as most East African societies were concerned, and because it was necessary to determine the extent to which the ivory trade has consequences comparable to the slave trade. There was definitely a qualitative difference between the two. The ivory trade led to professionalization, which, like the slave trade, but bands of elephant hunters found for example among Kauko and Banganda and Nyamwinzi and Bambara, all positive additions to the social structures, while bands of professional raiders and man-stealers were threat to established societies. Andrew Roberts' study of the evidence related to Nyamwinzi ivory trade has shown that this long-distance trade sparked off other beneficial developments, such as an increased trading, goods, food, and salt. There were other African exports such as gum, rubber, camwood, and wax, which also had certain beneficial effects on socioeconomic patterns when they were traded, showing clearly that slaving was in the category by itself. Many of the other commodities were accommodated within the colonial trade of the late 19th century, indicating that their exports was comparable with the exploitation of African labor within Africa, an objective with which slave trade obviously came into sharp conflict. On the other hand, ivory was an asset that was rapidly exhausted in any given region. and the struggle to secure new supplies sometimes brought violence almost indistinguishable from the produced by slaving. Besides, the most decisive limitations of the ivory trade was the fact that it was not an outgrowth of local products, and it caused restructuring independent upon an overseas market. The Nyamwinzi were trading articles of African manufacturers among African long before the export of trade opened up. In the sense, regional trade provided the, quote, capital for the long-distance ivory trade, but from then on, any expansion of local manufacturing was incidental to rather than the goal of local economies, caught up in the international trade network, and the expansion was very limited. They didn't allow them to develop their economies and trades with inside and outside. They were just subdued to the what do they call it? Of like all the international trading. Yeah, international trading network. Yeah. So let's see here. This kind of conceptualization is completely lacking in reconstructions of African history. In a sizable volume of essays devoted to, quote, trade in the Central and East African before 1900s, end quote, where there is now here expressed any awareness that the professionalization of trade per se is no great thing, and that it meant not development but the subordination of local economies in the case of Africans' relations with Europe. Andrew Robert ends his study of Nyamwinzi, so it's Nyamwezi trade as follows. And here we go. It would seem, then, that we are obliged yet again to conclude that only ruled by representatives of superior technology could provide the conditions for sustaining advance from the subsistence economy. This was, indeed, partly due to the very manner in which the region had become already linked to, and in a sense dependent on, the economies of the industrialized world. Again, Africa is developing Europe and making Europe more developed, and within that, maintaining independence on Europe and also underdevelopment. The writer of those lines should be given credit for at least an hesitant acknowledgement of the notion of, quote, independence, which is so central to an understanding of underdevelopment. For the rest, the statement is timid and confusing. Why is it that representatives of superior technology were required to carry Africans out of the subsistence economy, and they were not necessary to perform similar functions for Europeans and most Asians? It was precisely the external links which preclude the possibilities of independent, self-sustaining advice. And that was true for the Nyamwezi ivory trade, as it was of the K.A. Kazembe. I can't say these words. K-A-Z-E-M-B-E trade in captives. Besides, at all times, one must keep in mind the dialectical opposite of the trade in Africa, namely production in Europe or in the Americas under European control. A few social desirable byproducts of elephant hunting within Africa were chicken feed in comparison with the profits, technology and skill associated with the product of Europe. The ivory marts, M-A-R-T, in Mimping Lane were the centers where real profit on ivory trade was made. the tusks were augmented in value when they were turned into billiard balls or piano keys in London, and when they went to Sheffield to transform into knife handles, and to Dapie and Gilslingen to be made into hundreds of different artifacts by marine processes. Europe was strengthened by these and numerous other foreign-fed industries to carry Africa out of their own developing capitalist economy in the most disadvantaged situation possible. European technology was not as superior to that in other parts of the world in the 15th century as it often assumed. Their supremacy in that aspect at the present time is itself more a consequence than a cause of their hegemony over the rest of the world. In the 15th century, Europe merely had the edge over humanity elsewhere in the scientific understanding of the universe, and the making of tools and rational organization of work. One of the major shortcomings of European in the 15th and 16th century was the shortage of commodities for exchange. As has already been illustrated, they were forced to make use of Asian and, to the lesser extent, African consumer goods, which were often of superior quality. Yet, as is also implicit in earlier sections of this analysis, European superiority in certain sectors proved decisive. African and Polynesian canoes were a high standard, but the relevant sphere of operation was the ocean, where European ships could take command. West Africans had developed metal castings to the fine artistic perfection in many parts of Nigeria, but when it came to the meeting with Europe, beautiful bronze were far less relevant than the crudest of canoes. African wooden utensils were sometimes works of great sensitivity, but Europe produced pots and pans that had many functional disadvantages. Literacy, numeracy, and organizational experience, and the capacity to produce on an ever-expanding scale, even under the domestic system, were also very meaningful advantages on the European side and of the scale. Once Africa was drawn into the orbit of Western Europe, the latter's technological development was speeded up, as already noted in the case of several other aspects of their economy. For example, the evolution of European shipbuilding from the 16th to the 19th century was a logical consequence of their monopoly of sea commerce after 15th century. During the same period, the North Africans were bottled up in the Mediterranean, and although it was from there that Europe borrowed a great deal of nautical instrumentation, the North Africans made no further worthwhile advances. Where the initial European advantages was not sufficient to assume supremacy, they deliberately undermined other people's efforts. The Indian Navy, for instance, suffered from the rigid enforcement of English navigation laws. Yet the expenses involved in building new and better European ships were met with profit of overseas trade, such as with India and Africa. What is this? I'm looking back. Alright, looks like everybody's just coming in and out, which is fair. The Dutch were pioneers in improving upon the caravels which took the Spanish and Portuguese out across the Atlantic. the succession of Dutch trading companies operating in Asia, Africa, and America were the ones responsible for experimentation. By the 18th century, the British were using Dutch know-how as a basis for surpassing the Dutch themselves, and the Atlantic was their laboratory. It used to be said that the slave trade was a training ground for British seamen. It is probably more significant to note that the Atlantic trade was a stimulator of consistent advances in naval technology. We know a fair amount about the evolution of science in Europe prior to overseas expansion, and it is possible to evaluate the catalytic contribution of non-European world in the epoch of mercantilism. The technological revolution of the 18th and 19th century in Europe sprung from the interplay of numerous variables rooted entirely in European experience, but they all have to be placed in the context of capitalist development, and it is no mere coincidence that the crucial engineering inventions of the late 18th century followed after the profits from external trade had been internalized by Western European capitalism. We know far less about the evolution of African technology, but commerce with Europe had no positive effects in this sphere because they just took it over and appropriated it and destroyed whatever other things are. Hey, Khadija. In the first place, craft skills would have suffered from the plague of slaving on the areas directly affected. Much has been made of the destructive aspects of the Nangona incursion northwards into South Africa. In the lake, Nyasa Lake or Tanganyika corridor, warfare and raiding virtually obliterated cloth and hoe making. Slave recruitment was warfare and pillage on a grand scale, and most have had an analogous effect for the vast area concerned. For greater importance, however, were the indirect consequences of trade as such, including the impact of imports and European subversion of local trade. I keep getting the little thingies. It says African economic history. It's kind of weird to hear that. This is following the, okay. The relationship of African technology and clothing manufacturing, let me show you her line. Tanganyika, raiding virtually, warfare in the village. The greatest importance, however, I'm going to read this sentence again, everybody. Of greater importance, however, were the indirect consequences of trade as such, including the impact of imports and European subversion of local trade. The relationship of African technology to cloth manufacturing is worthy of note, given the strategic role of textiles. Have played in the economic development of Western Europe, Japan, and the U.S. From the 15th and 19th century, the demand for cloth in Africa was constantly expanding. All areas experienced a shift from car nudity through animal skins and bark cloth to cotton. Indian and European textiles helped meet this expanding demand, while areas like Senegambia, Ivory Coast, Benin, Yorubaland, and Luengo were exporters to other parts of Africa through European intermediaries for the most part. But the volume of European production was so constantly increasing, along with the skills, so that Dutch and English manufacturers in the 18th century copied fashionable Indian and American patterns, since they have established a stronghold on local distribution. The products they brought had to be accepted, even though they were inferior to the originals. By the late 19th century, European textiles were being imported in sufficient quantities to swamp local production and to make regions such as Senegambia into exporters of raw cotton and importers of finished cotton clothes. Wherever remnants of the industry surveyed, production was in the same technological mold of earlier centuries, because the narrow looms were never permitted to respond to the kind of demands which would have forced a breakthrough. With regards to textiles as well as iron, European imports were presumably viewed by Africans as supplementary to their own production of those items, so long as there was a sufficient market. One would expect that if the foreign commodity became a threat to local manufacturing, the affected African would make a stand. For example, to this effect was salt industry of Sierra Leone, which was protected by local African edict, including salt as an import in the 18th century. The reason was sound, because in the early 19th century, British ships sailed to Nigeria, carried cheap salt to the detriment of local production. See, they're destroying local production and local economies. Yet the industry and skills which actually existed and were destroyed were probably of less consequence than the loss of the development opportunity. This cannot be calculated, but it must be ignored. The editors of the aforementioned volume of East and Central African trade illustrate the disruption of industry and skills in the Congo and Angola through the interventions of the Portuguese and their half white, half black, they said the M-word, and black servants in African commerce. They recognized that the demands of the Atlantic trade, quote, ended by subverting the whole commercial structure with its attendant local industries, end quote. But in the same breath, they contend that, quote, the opening of the overseas market does not seem to have altered in any radical way the roles which commerce played in the economy of the area, end quote. Here, again, the basic weakness of a failure to distinguish between an independent economy in evolution and one that is being transformed into a satellite. In the former, commercial activity is entirely the consequence of the level of development of the productive forces, whereas in the latter, it is mainly a reflection of external needs. For slaving regions like Congo and Angola in the 16th and 17th century, it means that the role of commercial activity was no longer simply a distribution of local products, nor was it the export of those products, nor was it the export compatible with the old. That is what cut off the possibilities of evolution along previous lines, even though the worst effect were differed for a considerable period until Europe itself was powerful enough to take complete control through such means as the sending of commodities to replace those that had formerly been locally made. So saturating their markets with bullshit items because they were able to produce them at mass scale. What's up, Carrot? They were able to produce it at mass scale. Any trade in Africa, which was an extension of European production, was largely irrelevant to the technological advance within Africa. When Britain was the world's leading economic power, it used to be referred to as a nation of shopkeepers. Most of the goods in their ships were produced by themselves. Africa from Senegal to the I think it's Kununi, Cunene, and from the Limpopo to the Tanan, busied themselves selling gondos that they had not produced. So they're selling things that they haven't produced. Okay, good. They were agents for distributing European imports and for organizing the exports of a few staples which were not in demand within the continent. The Afro-Portuguese middlemen, the Upper Guinea of Upper Guinea, and Akan, which is AKAN, market women and Arrow traders of the bight of Bafra, and the Pembroas of Angola, the Yao traders of Mozambique, and the Swahili of Nyamwenzi of East Africa were not performing a function which is essentially the same as that being carried out today by members of a disproportionality large service sector. Their contributions to technological development was nil because they were on the fringe of production. Commerce with Europe was not proportionous. Let me say propitious. Let me make sure I'm saying this word right. I think it's proportionate, but I'm not sure. I'm not great at announcing. Hey, Joker. I'm getting there, everybody. Propit. Propitious, which means giving or indicating a good chance of success, favorable. Okay, good. Commerce in Europe was not propitious to independent technological inventions on the African side, nor did it create any consistent demand for the import of European technology, except for firearms. Europeans' response to that with the cheapest of muskets that they deliberately ignored were the exceptional African request that Europe should place certain skills and techniques at the disposal of Africa. This was an element of the Congo situation already alluded to when Ajide Trudeau, which is when I think it's the Dahomey king. No, that's the Congolese. No. I think it might be either the Congo king or the Dahomey, sought to stop the slave trade. He also made an appeal to European craftsmen, and he sent an ambassador to London for that proposal. One European who stayed at the court of Dahomey in the late 1720s told his countrymen that, quote, if any tailor, carpenter, smith, or any other sort of white man that is free be willing to come here, he will find very good encouragement, end quote. At about the same time, I'm going to try again, Ajidajia Trudeau, that's hard, was seeking new skills from Europe. The Ashantifia Opoko, where 1720 to 1750, was also thinking about those lines. He country and got no response. Those requests were coming from the area of Africa that were sufficiently developed to have been able to incorporate new production techniques without any great dysfunctions. This was also true for Ethiopia. A Portuguese embassy reached the Ethiopian court in 1520 having examined Portuguese sword, muskets, cloth, clothes, books, and other objects, the emperor, oh my gosh, Limbeni Dangal felt the need to reintroduce European technical knowledge into Ethiopia. Corresponding exist between the emperor and European dignitaries such as Diego de Albuquerque, wow, Portuguese viceroy in India, Kings Manuel I and John the Third of Portugal, and Pope Leo X, in which requests were made for European assistance to Ethiopian industries. Until late in the 19th century, Ethiopian petitions to that effect were being repeated with scant success, probably with no success. What's up, Avery? Keep when I call you Helios, I'm sorry. One of the most profound facets of the cultural arrogance of European colonialists in Africa was their boastfulness about technological accomplishment and their contemptuous attitudes towards what they considered as African non-achievements in that sphere. Quote, they, Africans, had no plow, no wheel, no means of transportation except human head portage and dugout canoes on river and lakes. These people had built nothing of any kind of material more durable than mud, poles, and hatch. End quote. Disgusting. That's not true. The above words of the British colonial governor are relatively mild specimens of the technological superiority syndrome. Such statements sprung from and strengthened the racist assumption of African people were incapable of the discovery and applications of scientific law. Yet the evidence suggests that it was the connection between Europe and Africa which aided the technological maturation. Let me make sure. I'm gonna make sure, everybody. Let me make sure.
Maturation.
Yeah, maturation, the action or process of maturing. Okay. Of technological maturation of the former, while inducing a period of technological marking time and even regression in Africa. Furthermore, the issues of inventiveness is subordinate to the diffusion of techniques. Europeans did not invent the wheel. It spread from China, both because of the structure of international trade and because of the conscious decisions of European states. Africa was robbed of the opportunity to benefit from the scientific heritage of man. In the centuries before colonial rule, European scientific and technical capacity increased by progression, while Africa appeared to have been almost static. What was the slight edge when the Portuguese rounded Cape Bajador in 1444 was a huge gap. By the time that the Europeans robber statesmen sat down at Berlin 440 years later. The growing technological gap between Western Europe and Africa was consistent with the trend of capitalism to polarize wealth and power on one hand and poverty dependency on the other. In the present imperialist epoch, super profits from the independencies have to some extent improved the standards of living of the metropolitan worker. But in the earlier period, internal exploitation strengthened external exploitation and vice versa. At the national level within Western Europe, The unevenness of development had already been noted. This was sharply in evidence by the 19th century, with areas such as Portugal, Spain, and Ireland playing colonial roles with aspects to Britain, France, and Germany inside the national economies. The polarization also expressed itself in the elimination of small producers and the rise of monopolies. But the monopolies, therefore, were at a pinnacle of a system that knew nothing but profit-making and domination as its guiding principles. The monopolies set the tone for international political economies in the late 19th century. They intervened directly in Central and Eastern Europe through massive investments and on a slightly smaller scale. Western Europe monopolies sought financial and economic opportunities in Asia and Latin America. They were joined in this imperialist partition of the world by North American capital. The U.S. having been transformed from an outpost of Europe into one of the command centers of capitalism. Africa by then was somewhat in a doldrum as far as Europe was concerned. Its great period accumulating primary capital from European development was over. Nevertheless, Europe still had a place in Africa within a new imperialist scheme of things. A few areas of the continent became crucial for European investment, namely Algeria, Egypt, South Africa, and Congo. Elsewhere, smaller European entrepreneurs were permitted. Let me look back. Okay. Were permitted to operate, although ultimately they too were tied to the big banking and industrial concerns which controlled Western European economy. And they were under the umbrella of nation states that bargained consciously and unconsciously as agents of monopoly capital. Thus the clash of Anglo-French financial interests in Egypt and the potential for investments in the Congo were keys which opened the doors to the, quote, scramble of Africa, end quote. That is, to the transformation of the continent into a political colony to protect economic spheres. Africa's history discussion joined the debate. Apart from the Suez Canal and the South African and Congolese mines, the investment in African continent in the late 19th century and subsequently as primarily to facilitate the production of agriculture staples to be utilized by the new industries of Europe. The expansion of soap making, the rise of a wider market for cooking fats, and the need for lubricants in railways and engineering works led to the exploitation of a palm oil resource in West Africa, while the German machine industry could produce plants for crushing palm kernels to provide stock feed for capitalist agriculture. The extension of demands for cooking oil and fats also affected groundnuts, the opportunity being exploited by the financiers and the industrialists in Marseilles. The Lancashire cotton industry, after its long partnership with the American slave South, was in the late 19th century anxious to promote the growing of cotton in Egypt and the Sudan and East and West Africa. The inventions of the fomatic tube. Let me make sure I got that right. It says, I think it's fomatic tube. Let me make sure I got that right. I'm saying it right. Fomatic. I think it says fomatic. Let me see. I'm not saying it. Wait. Let me make sure. I won't even give me the definition. It's pneumatic. The arrival of the motor car and the increase in the rubber-wheeled transport of all sorts taxed the rubber-producing capacity of the each in the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Brazil, and Africa. Such examples could be multiplied. They all demonstrate that Europe's needs by the late 19th century were themselves a product of the immense quickening of economic life over the previous 4 centuries, and one of the factors in that quickening was the unequal association with Africa. Equal significance is the fact that Europe derived the power to exploit Africa in new ways. Trade in slaves, ivory, and gold was conducted from the coast. Their European ships could dominate the scene, and when necessary, forts could be built. Before the 19th century, Europe was incapable of penetrating the African continent because of balance of force at their disposal was inadequate. So without a fight, they had a hard time, just like they had a hard time with indigenous people here. They had a hard time with African indigenous people. But the same technological changes which create the need to penetrate Africa also created the power to conquer Africa. From smooth-bore muzzle loaders and flintlocks of the previous era. It is no wonder that Europeans had no hesitation in selling Africans, oh my gosh, antediluvian models of firearm. Hillard Belloc spoke on behalf of his fellow Europeans when he said that, quote, "What matters is what we have, the Maxim machine gun, and they have not," end quote. Curiously, Europeans often derived the moral justification for imperialism and colonialism from features of the international trade as conducted up to the eve of colonial rule in Africa. The British were the major exponent of the view that the desire to colonize was largely based on their good intentions in wanting to put up a stop to the slave trade. True enough, they were by then as opposed to the slave trade as they were once in favor of it. Technological changes had dialectically transformed the 17th century necessity for slaves into the 19th century necessity to clear the remnants of slaving from Africa so as to organize the local exploitation of land and labor. Leopold in the Congo also used the anti-slavery pretext to introduce into Congo itself forced labor and slave-like practices, quote unquote. While at a deeper level, all Europeans had derived notions of radical and cultural superiority between the 15th and 19th centuries, so that even the Portuguese presumed that they were historically destined to, quote, civilize the natives, end quote. Disgusting. No worries. It's good to see you. Africans fought alien political rule and had to be subdued by superior force. But the sizable minority did not insist that their trade connections with Europe should remain unbroken, for that was a measure of the extent of which they were already dependent on Europe. The most dramatic illustration of that dependency was the tenacity with which some Africans fought the termination of slave trading. For most European capitalist states, the enslavement of Africans had served its purpose by the middle and 19th century, but for those Africans who dealt in captives and the abrupt termination of the trade at any given point was a crisis of the greatest magnitude. In many areas, major social changes had taken place to gear the region to the service of the slave trade. One of the most significant being the rise of domestic slavery, quote unquote, and various forms of class and caste subjugation. African rulers and traders who found their social existence threatened by the earliest legal edicts, such as Britain's abolishing of slave trade of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, found ways to make contact with Europeans who still wanted slaves. Where other commodities were suggested, tremendous efforts went into organizing those alternatives: ivory, rubber, palm oil, groundnuts, cotton, and so on. The transition to forms of production that used African labor inside Africa resulted in the rise of economic and social institutions that ensure the partition of a large number of Africans in the money economy, and also ensured that the value created would be siphoned off to capitalist Europe. Siphoned off to capitalist Europe, sorry. That gave rise to a particular form of structural dependency, which we know today, visibly seen in the bank branches, the import/export agencies, and the manufacturing subsidiaries, and the mining companies, the pattern of road and railway networks, and so on. So the pattern road and railway networks always led out towards the ports, never inside, led outwards to the ports. Needless to say, it is the intensive study of the colonial period which I will answer most of the questions about underdevelopment as we know it today, but the extent to which the situation was being set up for centuries before is often underestimated. The anthropologists were the worst offenders in this regard, with the ahistorical predictions for describing where everything that they found in the colonial Africa was, quote, traditional. But historians are also guilty of making the distinction between colonial and pre-colonial Africa in such a way as to cloud the facts that there was continuity from one phase to another. The notion that the first 4 centuries of Afro-European trade represents the roots of African underdevelopment is doubly attractive because there was an actual carryover of some of the mechanisms that connected the two spheres of metropoles and dependency. At the metropolitan end, there were the insurance companies, and the shipping companies, while in Africa itself, there had risen certain social formations that were immediately available to operate within the colonial enclave economies from the 1880s onwards. Those are the African traders already mentioned as a forerunner of the modern service sector. Some were highly placed within African society. Many were new men of previously low status, while many others were literally products of foreign trade, being the children of Europeans and Arabic people. The half black and half white, they used the bad word, elements were very pronounced in West Africa, and it continued to be prominent in the early colonial period for much later, in what was called the French Sudan. To take one specific example, all economic activity spread inland from the 4 communes of the Senegalese coast, inhabited by black people and half black, half white people, have long connections with Atlantic trade. So long as it is not based on settlement. A colonial system requires compradors. Yes, it does. Throughout most of Africa, those compradors at the start of the colonial period were already performing the function of independent trade economy. Besides, the Africans conducting trade on behalf of Europeans were inevitably influenced by European thought and values. The quest for European education did not begin in colonial Africa. It started when coastal rulers and traders recognized the need to penetrate more deeply into the way of life of the white man who came from across the sea. The half black, half white sons of white traders and the sons of African rulers were the ones who went furthest along this line. At one level, it was strictly functional. The Sierra Leone chief in the 18th century explained that he wished, quote, to learn book to be rogue as good as a white man, end quote. At another level, it meant unbibbing those values which led to further African subjugation. The Reverend Thomas Thompson was the first European educator on the, quote, Gold Coast, and he wrote in 1772 a pamphlet entitled The African Trade of Black Slaves Shown to be Consistent with the Principles of Humanity and the Laws of Revealed Religion. Oh my God. Justification. Jesus Christ. The returned Africans who played such a crucial role in Sierra Leone and throughout West Africa in the period of the establishment of colonial rule were also in varying degrees products of Western culture and education, strikingly embodying potentialities of both enlightenment and mental confusion sprang from deculturalization. Unfortunately, the latter trend was no more operative, and with the coming of colonial rule, they became cautious and naive agents. Hold on a second, gotta do a puzzle. God damn it, I can never get it right. Oh my God, I'm having a hard time, everybody. Stop. Hello. Come on. Thank you, Jesus Christ. Thank you. The coming of the colonial rule, they became cautious and naive agents of foreign domination. The culture nexus, therefore, provides further reasons for seeking the roots of African underdevelopment and dependency in the early centuries of Euro-African trade. There you go, the underdevelopment. And now we're on chapter 8, problems of developing world development. On reflection on the problem of developing world development, I recall an incident many years ago in the Republic of Guinea. Before I start, I'm going to go forward. Oh my God, this is another long chapter. I'm going to have to find stopping point. Well, Q&A could be a stopping point if I can get to there. All right, cool, here we go. On reflecting on the problems of developing world development, I recall the incident many months ago when the Republic of Guinea was invaded by the Portuguese. As soon as Chinese heard about the invasion, the Xinhua news agency put out a report denouncing American imperialism. Americans' name had not as yet been called by Guineans, but the Chinese, from objective analysis, decided that if the Portuguese were invading Guinea, it had something to do with American imperialism. And in like vein, I would suggest that if we were talking about the problems of development in the developing world, the major problem is the United States of America, because it crowns the whole structure of world imperialism. And I will leave this as an assertion because to go into a justification will consume time. However, I would like to illustrate in some ways the connection between imperialism and underdevelopment. In the United Nations, a certain euphemism is in use. They speak about the, quote, development, end quote, and the, quote, developing, end quote, market economies. These two collectively constitute the imperialist world. The imperialist world, the developed market economy being the United States, the Western European countries, and Japan, and the curious catar- uh, cat- category of the developing market economy, includes the rest of what is commonly referred to as the developing world, the economies of which were hooked into the metropolitan structures of North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Some of the mechanisms for exploiting the so-called developing countries have been known for a long time. For instance, unequal trade has been a common subject of discussion, and in recent times, it has received more careful analysis so that we know rather more than we used to about exactly how the captains of trade contributed to the exploitation of the underdeveloped world. This is on the position that a merely adopted by Marxists or radical nationalists. It is a position which is commonly asserted even by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. A second well-known mechanism of exploitation within the structures of imperialism is the transfer of profit from underdeveloped areas towards the metropoles. My only comment on this is to note that what is called, quote, profits is in fact, quote, capital. For too long most of us, including people who would call themselves leftists, have created an idiom of, quote, capital export from the colonies to the semi-colonies, and the very idiom obscures parts of the reality, indeed perhaps the whole reality. I am of the opinion that we cannot refer to the export of capital from the metropoles to the underdeveloped sectors of the world except in the limited sense. Historically, the movement of capital has always been on balance from the external of the peripheral sectors of the imperialist economy to it. Oh my gosh, I don't know this word. I have to look this word up.
بارك الله فيكم brother sister please يا brother please مساعدة.
We will do our best. What we have. I think it's epicenter. Yeah, epicenter. Economic to its epicenter. This began with the trade in slaves, while later it took the form of grossly unequal trade between Europe and the rest of the world. The most that it can be said about European capital, export, is that Europe. Hold on a second, everybody. I gotta do something. Okay. And the relocation of capital that is produced throughout the world. Capital produced in, say, the Caribbean or North America in the epoch of slavery was shifted to Europe and, at the later date, was redistributed from Western European to Eastern Europe, or capital that has obtained by forcing the Chinese to smoke opium was redistributed into the Indian sector of the British imperialist economy, and so on and so forth. But strictly speaking, there never has been any export of capital from the developed areas in the sense of capital being engendered and originating in the metropolitan sectors for export overseas. So my point about profit is that when we look at its mechanisms closely, we find that it is always a means, you can tell when I'm changing the page, a means of transferring to the metropolitan economy a capital produced out of the material and human resources of the developing world. Unequal trade and capital flow away from the underdeveloped countries are two of the principal mechanisms. Let me get that. I said unequal trade and capital flow away from the underdeveloped countries are two of the principal mechanisms of imperialism. There are others that are proving to be significant in their own ways, which tend to be left out of the literature and which are very operative when we come to think in terms of changing the status quo. One of these, for instance, is the blockage of technology, making technology uneven. This takes the number of forms. It could mean actual technological slowing down or arrest in the underdeveloped countries, or it could mean simply the blockage of the movement of technology from the metropolitan to the colonial economy. The best example of this actual destruction and slowing down of technology would come from Asia, notably China and India, and to the lesser extent from Africa. Examples of the failure to allow the transfer of whatever technologies was developed in Europe itself to the developing world can be taken at random, particularly in the more recent epoch we have had in Africa, striking instances of the refusal of the metropolitan capitalist/imperialist countries to allow the transfer of technology to certain critical areas which would pose a threat to their own exploitation and domination. Again, to keep them subjugated and all this shit. Let's see here. I'm looking back a little bit. African underdeveloped discussion in the historical. I love it. Weird. In Africa today, one of the biggest and best known projects is that of Tanzania-Zambian Railway. The whole history of this railway is one in which metropolitan countries set out to interfere with the movement of this particular aspect of technology to the part of the developing world, and they failed because in this instance the People's Republic of China was available as an alternative source. The corollary of the blockage of skilled and technology is that the international division of labor under imperialism has always ensured the development of world technology within certain specific sectors, namely the metropoles, and more recently, in particular, parts of the metropoles, allowing the United States to assume hegemony in most fields. This is an important phenomenon when we come to re-examine the contemporary evolution of imperialism, because the changes of technology which were possible in the last decades have made it possible for the imperialist countries to begin to adopt radically new strategies in terms of international division of labor and in terms of the kind of political control which they exercise over the developing world. Yet another general feature to which attention should be drawn in the way in which imperialism was restructured the world economy so that within the developing world there is no cohesion with respect to production and exchange. As one moves from colony to semi-colony to another colony or a semi-colony, one finds the breaking of the ties which formerly integrated one with the other. That is to say, the breaking of the trade ties which integrated the productive resources. One finds within the colony also the same distinction, the same disaggregation, of the consistent part of the colonized economy. Instead, the linkage are with the metropolitan economy and are determined exclusively by the latter in its own interest, an interest which proves and compatible with the independency and any real development of the developing world, because the developing world is developing the Western world. That's what's going on here. We're underdeveloping them so that we can be developed. Moving on forth from the essentially economic concerns, I wish to highlight the political facets of imperialism. A number of writers of Latin America, and to the lesser extent on Africa, had paid considerable attention to the creation of the developing world of certain stratas or certain classes which reflect the interest of the metropoles and which allows the requisite kinds of penetration and exploitation. The political control takes a number of forms. There is a classical colonial form. There is a utilization of white settlers, the most important in the recent period, where there was emerged in Africa and in Asia, and indigenous strata who conduct locally and the activity required to support the international economy. These are people who, in Fanon's words, performed the function of transmission lines and international monopoly capital. The foregoing represents a very brief portrayal of the mechanism of imperialism. I am not attempting to go into any serious theoretical justification of why imperialism is the big problem in developing world development, because hopefully we understand that. So perhaps we could proceed to look rather more closely at the movement of contemporary developing world history in order to better appreciate the problems and possible antidotes to underdevelopment. In the last decade, we have been, in a counter-revolutionary epoch, in spite of many of the festivities that have taken place, celebrating the so-called independency of various parts of Africa and Asia, and in spite of certain foco and liberation, we can say that a general movement of history in the developing world has been countered to any direction that one may term independence. This I will illustrate using a number of criteria. First of all, one can apply the Western bourgeoisie measurements of growth rates, although these are very limited and skewed. One finds that the growth of the developing world economy has failed to keep up with these norms, which have been established by groups such as the Parson Commission. Most developing world countries do not get that ratio of growth in bourgeoisie economic terms, which is supposed to represent their march forward. Very, very few have achieved the percentage, 6 to 8% growth rates, which are set by the bourgeoisie economists as prerequisites for development. Second, the more important is the fact that those criteria, where they are satisfied, do not lead to anything that the people of the country would call development. Hence, the rise of the term, quote, growth without development, end quote, which has already become current in the writings of West Africa. It has been seen that by using the criteria of GNP, gross national product, and per capita income, one finds a certain amount of growth undoubtedly taking place. But when this is examined in any serious detail, it is proved to be entirely misleading. As long as the local economy is part of the imperialist world economy, there is still an export of surplus that is the actual export of capital, and the redistribution of wealth within the so-called developing world countries is such that the vast majority of the people, oh my gosh, holy crap, the vast majority of the people can and do experience an actual lowering of their living standards, while the GNP and per capita income are supposedly rising. A few economists looking at the problems of economic development are beginning to apply the simplest of yardsticks by returning to factors such as housing, food, and clothing, the principal elements of man's existence, and the things that human beings have been striving for from the very onset of their attempts to deal with the material environment. In Jamaica, for example, it has been found that the units of housing for the vast majority of the people have been decreasing. More people are suffering from protein deficiency than was true of the earlier period, and more people are going about without shoes and without proper clothing than has been truer earlier. All this in spite of significant increase in GDP, gross domestic product. In Africa, one could readily cite Ivory Coast and Kenya in this respect, for such growth has shown by a statistical indices in these parts of Africa is not matched by an increase of well-being of the mass of the population. So GDP and all those things is all like, it hides what's really going on. The most ominous factor undermining attempts of achieve independency and development in the developing world has been the rise of new forms of exploitation and domination within the global capitalist economy. One of them is tourism. It has a nasty history in the Caribbean, particularly in Cuba. But in more recent times, it is becoming more extensive. By 1969, tourism was one of the biggest economic factors in Tanzania, of all places. Someone observed that, just as Latin America, there used to be a quote banana republics, end quote. So international imperialism was threatening to transform Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania into a quote wildlife republics. Every effort was made to attract tourists to look at animals, and the animals assumed priorities higher than human beings. Incidentally, it is not at all true that it is the indigenous people who are, changing the thing, responsible for such diminution and in wildlife population as has occurred in recent years, because groups like the Maasai, MAASAI, has always coexisted with the lions and wild game. No, so they're taking advantage of freaking Jesus Christ. Oh my God. How much more do I have? Let me find out how much more I have. I don't know if I'll be able to get to it. And in recent times, the problems of game conservation is of far lesser magnitude than that of human development and that of survival and creativity of peoples of the region. Certainly tourism
بليز يا برادر يستر مساعدة بليز.
tourism in all its
نوطن نوهل بليز.
Please give gifts, please. Tourism in all its aspects is proving to be one of the new areas of expansion of the imperialism economy. It is a new way of confirming the dependency and subjugation of developing world economies, being seen in its most adherent and vicious form in the Caribbean territories. Several islands in the Caribbean have been transformed into backwater of the world economy. They are no longer central to the development of the world economy because they have lost the priority that they had a long time ago when sugar was king. It is a relatively simple task to transform them into cesspools, which is what tourism economy is all about. A more significant, I need to look ahead, hold on. I'm not gonna be able to get to the questions and shit. Holy fuck, it's so long to go. Okay. A more significant aspect of the new trend of domination is that which economists are calling the, quote, branch plant economy.
بليز يا برادر مساعدة سبورت مساعدة بليز no food no water no help.
It made its impact felt first in Latin America and then in Asia, and it slowly began to touch on the African continent. This is a very subtle development, a negative effect of which remains let me make sure, which remains unperceived for some time because many people have been preoccupied with looking at the old forms of international division of labor. Thereby, the underdeveloped countries were allocated roles connected either with agriculture or with the production of raw materials in the extractive mineral industry. It was felt by the leaders like Nkrumah when he came to power in Ghana that the answer was to create industry in Africa. The dichotomy was simply industry versus agriculture, of processing versus the export of unprocessed goods. Now imperialism has been able to circumvent the criticisms that it reduces the developing world merely to primary production. The international bourgeoisie and their agents have been able to start industrialization, quote unquote, of the sort within developing world countries. Looking at the development plans of every African nation, one finds that a beer factory will usually figure number one or number two on the list. Building a beer factory is considered as the first step towards industrialization. Quite apart from the fact that I don't know of beer as having developed any nation, one has to realize the fallacy on which the claim is based. The underlying notion is that industrialization per se is the answer to underdevelopment. Therefore, the logic of that argument is that if the country ceases to import beer and instead develops an import substitute by making a beer locally, then a step has been made in the direction of development. This resorts to import substitutions has characterized a lot of the development plans of the developing world outside of the really progressive areas. And what in fact it means is that the capitalist structures in the metropoles have reached the stage where the export of consumer goods is no longer really critical, but the export of certain capital in goods is much more crucial. The capital goods sector has experienced tremendous growth in the period of colonial exploitation, at the period of semi-colonial exploitation, and there is now an objective necessity for the metropoles to export these capital goods, namely the plants that manufacture the beer, cigarettes, and even textiles. Of course, the metropoles seek to incorporate their productive enterprises within the total structures of monopoly capital, which takes the form of the multinational corporation. The multinational corporation perceives the advantage of extending its operations into various other parts of the globe. Today, it is not considered opportune merely to produce in the United States and Germany and to sell abroad. More markets can be explored by actual setting up the, quote, branch plants, end quote, in Brazil, in Singapore, and in the Ivory Coast, and so forth. The movement of contemporary developing world political development throughout Africa and through Asia also shows tremendous deterioration. Latin America is exceptional only because it had its formal dependency ever since the early 19th century, and Latin America has gone through the kinds of trauma which Africa and parts of Asia are only now beginning to experience. The dictators and the coups in Latin America were the butt of jokes when jokes even in the colonial world. In the West Indies, we used to say that if there was no coup in Latin America on a particular day, it would be announced on the radio as an item of significance, quote, no coup anywhere in Latin America today, end quote. In Latin America, countries have perhaps settled down to the pattern of more stable dictatorships, but they certainly have not, in most places, begun to tackle the problems of political stability in terms of the development of their own people. In any event that I have to say relates more to Asia and Africa, I will pick my examples mainly from Africa and from the Caribbean. In these instances, constitutional independency took place during the last decade. Subsequently, we have witnessed the rationalization of political dependency and economic dependency in much sharper forms. And of course, the two cannot be separated. It is the illusion to put forward the notion of political dependency without economic dependency, because politics is about making choices, and it seems to be incredible that someone should say, quote, we have no control over our economy, but we can make political choices, end quote. What happened after constitutional independency was, of course, the rise of a new form of political manipulation on the part of imperialism. Deterioration of this independency has been taking place because of a number of factors. First, under the control of imperialism, developing world countries have a sort of political vacuum nationally that arises from the fact that power does not reside locally. The national government of the petite bourgeoisie have little control over production and is endowed with a very feeble political base. They, of course, have police and military forces which are intended to serve the means of coercion and of the population, but nothing else. And appreciation, let me see. Okay, I see one coming up. Appreciation of these facts is fundamental to the understanding of the trends towards militarism, because if political regimes is so bankrupt that it is entirely dependent upon military, if it was a resort of authoritarianism, then who is more authoritarian than the army? So the army frequently decides to take over the role of government, rather than merely being the police force of civilians in power. We also find that the petite bourgeoisie in the developing countries are not as capable as bourgeoisie in the metropoles when it comes to playing a certain kind of political game. They are not capable of granting their own population participation in bourgeoisie democracy, because the colonial situation is antithetical to any form of democracy, even to bourgeoisie democracy. The American bourgeoisie, to use this example, is powerful enough to realize that it can afford certain forms of bourgeoisie democracy unless the stage is reached where the system is eroded, that they must take to fascist alternatives. But normally, the bourgeoisie will of necessity engage the large middle class sector and large segments of the working population in parliamentarism, free speech, and the like. In the developing world, this is seldom possible. The petite bourgeoisie who resides in Accra and in Kingston and in Singapore cannot afford to have any formal exercises of democracy. They do not have the power. They do not have the economic base. They are entirely dependent on two things. First, the external support, and second, whatever local police forces they can muster. Increasingly, the political situation of these developing world countries become more openly authoritarian. A striking example has been the regime of Forbes Barham in Guyana. He began some years ago by trying to convince some folks that he was about nationalism and even about socialism. To a large extent, he succeeded in the mystification, but after just a few years, the mask has been removed, and it is now apparent that Guyana has the markings of a kind of Haitian situation, given the trends towards the creation of a oh my gosh, I can't say this, ton Amy, let's see, how much more do I have? I think I can make it to my stopping point here. Yeah, I'm gonna go to the stopping point that I have marked off from last time. So I'm gonna go a little bit over, everybody. Aiming at political intimidation and assassinations. This and other indications in the most of Africa and Asia suggest that neocolonialism is not merely a state, but like all historical forms, it has its own motion, and both politically and economically, the motion is a negative direction. I would like to try to explore some of the difficulties facing political progressive groups within developing world territories, groups who analyze the situation and problems of development, and who ask themselves the classic question, quote, what is to be done, end quote. How do they function? Or how have they been functioning? And what kind of projections can be made for near the distant future? Using a crude distinction between the political and economic facets of the problem, I will suggest that a real issue at the moment and for the foreseeable future is not the economic issue of a political one, but not an economic issue, but a political one. Sorry. It has already been affirmed that the fundamental nature of the development problem in the developing world is the relationship with the metropolitan economies and the nature of dependency, lack of integration, absence of technology, and so on, which are all essentially a primarily economic phenomenon. Nevertheless, we should distinguish between what may be fundamental, which I think is economic, and what has a priority. The latter refers to questions of timing, and that is where politics takes precedent. It will be necessary to look briefly at some of the economic problems, but the emphasis here will be on political ones. Progressives residing within developing world countries, virtually without exception, now pose the problem of economic development in terms of disengagement, end quote. How do you break with the dominant imperialist system? This question marks a change from a lot of preoccupations of the decade for 5 years ago, because it has become clear to the minority at any rate that some kinds of proposed solutions are not solutions at all, but rather an intensification of the problem. That is to say, solutions by way of aid, by way of further foreign entanglement, by way of so-called local capitalist development, are not really solutions, as an awareness of their insidious nature springs from the correct historical appraisal of a form of involvement between on the one hand Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and on the other hand the European and North American economies plus Japan. Historically, this involvement has been the detriment of the developing world countries, and therefore it becomes odd to suggest that further involvement, that an intensification of the involvement, would provide a solution. The solution lies in disengaging and disentangling from the historical bonds. In other words, if the answer is not in further engagement, if it is not in aid, if it is not an increased one's traditional exports, if it is not merely an import substitution, then it must lie in terms of rebuilding one's economy so that it becomes a logical, integrated whole. It must lie in terms of creating linkages between developing world economies, starting from the continental base within Latin America and within Africa, and it must lie in rebuilding and regenerating or starting afresh, if necessary, the technological development of the developing world, which has been arrested, or which has been sidestepped in one way or another. These are undoubtedly tremendous tasks. Certain kinds of solutions are already being indicated, but the main thing is to identify the direction in which one has to investigate. As long as so many poor economists have been looking at aid theories and at forms of playing around that devaluing of reevaluating currency or other techniques, which all have as their basis a preoccupation with sustaining links with the imperialist economy, then for so long we have not been looking at the real problems. We have not been turning up any valid solutions. However, before any progressive within the developing world can get down to work into the economy's minutiae, they have to deal with the political problems. Indeed, the tendency on the part of progressive groups within the developing world, almost there guys, countries, to invade the issues of getting at political preconditions to economic development is itself a problem of underdevelopment. In my own days as an undergrad at the University of the West Indies, several of us did sit down and try to work out a schema concerning that of new political economy would look like. There was no dearth of talk about that society, what society should look like. Many socialists in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have been dealing with that issue for a long time, but it is only a very tiny minority who have been concerned with trying to analyze the movement of history as it is subsequently to determine what actions was needed to obtain political leverage. In other words, the question of power has been avoided, and without that, one is only talking about blueprints, which is essentially an occupation of idle bourgeoisie philosophers. And we'll end there. I'm gonna put stop. So we're ending on 140. 140, ending there. So it's just the underdeveloped of economies, the complete underdevelopment of any type of trade, any type of things, and like the unevenness of technologies and the building of comprador classes to maintain the connection with the imperialists in the imperialist economy. Who's up? Who's in there? Khadija. All right. Palestine. Yes, Palestine. Okay. All right. I don't see anything coming back. Just see you talking to other people. All right. I think since no one wants to come up, I can never say antiquity. I don't know how to say it. Of history. Oh, nice. Thank you for coming up. Thank you for showing up, everybody. Appreciate this. But since no one has anything to say, it's pretty good. It's just how they developed from the slave trade into other things to colonialism and then to neocolonialism, and then talking about all the underdeveloped countries and how they have their economies taken away. And then we talked about tourist economies that are forced upon, and the fact that maintaining the animals was more of a thing than maintaining the actual humans. So they succumbed that indigenous group to mere people to show Westerners and the imperialist forces the animals and shit like that. So yeah, a lot of these developing worlds fell to tourism and shit like that, which is detrimental. It's just for the imperialists to come in to relax, you know. But yeah, not giving any real technology, not really any political strength or power, but also applying a computer class to keep things going. So yeah, I think that's what I got out of it. I'm not sure, but anyways, I wish you all good. I wish you all well.